Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicole Mejia, and I'm across the state in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm one of the co-directors of the Migrant and Immigrant Community Action Project, or the MICA project, and we provide immigration legal services here in the region and most of the eastern half of the state of Missouri. So thanks so much for having me today.
Thank you, Nicole. Luis, if you want to go next.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Luis Guerra. I'm the Director of Field Engagement at the Catholic Legal Immigration Network. We're a national network of over 450 immigration legal services organizations. And I'm honored to be on today's panel with two of our affiliate agencies in the region, both with Genesis and Nicole. I myself am based in at the border region at the Tijuana, San Diego region, but our organization is national in reach and has a staff throughout the entire country supporting the legal training efforts to ensure that our legal advocates all over the country have what they need to be most impactful. Thank you.
Genesis, if you'd like to go next.
Yes, everyone. Good morning. My name is Genesis Mercado. I'm an attorney working in Kansas City at a nonprofit there, we mostly serve people in the Kansas region and in Missouri. And yeah, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for asking me to be here.
I have Judy in person with me today.
Hi, everybody. I'm Judy Ansel, and I'm with the Cross Border Network, which is an organization based in Kansas City. I am by trade a labor educator and interested in a lot of labor issues having to do with immigrants.
Okay, thank you all for being here. And Genesis very kindly agreed to join us last minute to share her experience with working with immigrant families on the Kansas side. So we'll be hosting a brief Q&A for her around 9:45 a.m. before she has to leave. So throughout the presentation, you're welcome to submit questions in the Q&A box, and we'll address those either at 11 for all of our other three speakers, or around 9:45 for Genesis. So if you have any questions for her, please do submit them before. Thank you so much. So I'll get started with Judy. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Janitul. It's really a pleasure to be here to talk about a subject which I have thought about for a long time. And I call this talk, They Come Because They Can't Stay. And I want to give a little history about why people come here from Latin America, and particularly from Mexico and Central America, as we learned it in my organization. So a few questions of you guys first, and this will have to be just from the people who are right here. First off, who here is an immigrant? We only have two? Three? Okay. Where are you from and back?
I'm from Mexico.
Mexico. Okay. How about you? Oh, you raised your hand? No?
That's because I'm wrong. I thought we're all immigrants.
Oh, all right. Okay, fine.
I was being tricky, sorry.
Anybody else an immigrant? No. Okay. You? What? Mexico. Okay. Where was your shirt made? Look at the label.
Honduras.
Huh?
Honduras.
Honduras. China.
No.
You can't look at somebody else.
I'm certain mine was Cambodia.
Okay, Cambodia. Okay, point being that most of the clothes we wear are not made in the United States. And just as we have many immigrants in, not so much in this audience, but in our community, we also have products from all over the world because we live in a globalized economy, which makes me wonder why it is that the culture of this country is so anti-immigrant. And that's something I'll talk about as well. Who knows when NAFTA was passed?
98.
Huh?
98.
98, she says, that's wrong.
Oh.
Anybody else?
In the 50s.
The 50s.
Maybe, no?
No? Anybody else want to guess?
During the Clinton.
Yeah, it's very.
Yeah, it was Clinton. What? You're right. So she's right, it's Clinton, but that's the wrong year. It was 1993.
Oh.
It was one of the early things in the Clinton administration. We're going to talk about NAFTA. Who knows what neoliberalism is? How many of you have ever heard the term neoliberalism? Couple of you. Okay, well, neoliberalism is well known as a term is well known around the world, not as much in the United States, but it is an apt description of the policies that many world governments, including our own, have followed over the last 40 years. Since at least 1980, but actually starting before then. And just here's a few things that characterize neoliberalism. First off, a free, deregulated market, growth and profit above all. Okay, if it makes a profit, it's good. Privatization of government services. I'm sure many of you who work in social services know that one. Lean production, stressing systems. How many of you spend hours on the phone because the system doesn't work? Yeah, that's part of what's called lean production, whereas you remove as many resources as you can. And even though it'll still function, that's fine, even though the system is always stressed. Tax cuts primarily benefiting the rich. A tax on the rights of labor, taking away labor laws that help people, keeping the minimum wage really low, et cetera, et cetera. Massive unintended increase in corruption as democratic norms wane. We see this all over the world in countries from the United States to India to Mexico to Central America, where as neoliberal policies come in, and rich people really benefit way more than poor people, corruption also increases. Those are some of the things that have characterized the world and contributed to an upsurge of migration around the world. Something like 275 million people in the world are working in a country outside of their own home country. And a lot of it is because of these policies. And finally, I can't see that here because of this bottom thing, globalization and a globalized economy witnessed by your shirts. Okay. So my organization, the Cross Border Network, was founded in 1998 in Kansas City on the heels of NAFTA. And we began our work in Nuevo Laredo in the state of Tamaulipas in Mexico. And we began to see just what the fruits of these kinds of policies and NAFTA itself, which is a free trade, so-called free trade agreement, were. Here's an example. That's the Delphi Auto Parts factory in Nuevo Laredo. That's the effluent flowing into the Rio Grande River from that factory in the industrial park where it was located. That's a river. That's actually a stream. Very polluted. We once saw a fish with two tails. These are the shacks that many of the workers lived in because they were paid what one organizer called wages of hunger. And that's a boy with birth defects as a result of the tremendous chemical pollution that his parents got in the factories they worked in. And we began to see, the byproduct of so-called cheap products, which supposedly kept our jobs here, but of course they didn't. And as soon as NAFTA was passed, thousands and thousands of jobs left the United States. So NAFTA created a situation of increased exploitation, a surge in migration from Mexico, and it began what's called the race to the bottom. That's a poster I took a picture of at a conference in Tijuana back in the early 2000s. That's how that Mexican artist saw what was going on. many photos begin to emerge of people crossing the border in one way or another. And cartoons showing what became known as the race to the bottom, where we were all, as workers, competing with one another for lower and lower wages. So here is a more sort of academic look at what NAFTA did. It was an agreement among elites with only empty promises for working people. Remember, when we lost our jobs, we were supposed to get trade adjustment assistance. As one worker told me who worked at a shoe factory in Missouri, yeah, the trade adjustment assistance is to retrain us to go work at Walmart. It created one North American market and thereby an incentive for jobs to move to Mexico. And jobs moved from Canada as well to Mexico. Some jobs moved from here to Canada. Wages dropped everywhere, but the large differential between US Canadian wages on the one hand and Mexican wages on the other hand didn't improve. It was about somewhere between 10 and 15 to 1, the difference in wages. So when we first started working in Mexico, $5 a day was pretty much the standard wage in the export factories, from General Motors to Zenith to Sony. They were all paying about $5 a day. So if you were earning such low amounts of money, you probably couldn't afford housing. So you lived in a shack or something resembling a shack. You couldn't educate your children because in Mexico, you had to pay for children to go to school, and you had to get books, and you had to get uniforms and all of that kind of stuff. And you probably weren't eating very well either. So there's this tremendous incentive then to send one of your family members to the United States to work to subsidize the low wages that General Motors was paying you. And we ran into family after family after family that had relatives in the United States, often the father, sometimes the oldest son, working on some roof in Houston or someplace like that. And we began to say, wait a minute, there's a huge connection here between these policies, these neoliberal policies of the United States and the surge in migration. And it also didn't develop Mexico. The factories that we visited, and I went to every town along the border between Matamoros and Tijuana. These were islands with no development around them. You know, when we think of industrialization, we think, oh, there's going to be a lot of spin-off businesses. There'll be stores. You didn't see this in Mexico. It enraged Americans and Canadian workers. And one of the main reasons we founded the Cross-Border Network was because I said I was a labor educator. I got really sick and tired of hearing workers at Ford or General Motors or some other place say those GD Mexicans stole our jobs. And so we began to bring workers together between American workers and Mexican workers so that they could understand each other's situations. NAFTA also bankrupted Mexican farmers. The greatest surge of migration actually came from the rural countryside. A lot of the people we met in the maquilas were former campesinos who couldn't make it anymore because Monsanto and Cargill and all were taking over Mexican agriculture or just exporting from the US. Mexico, of course, invented corn, and Mexico during the early years of NAFTA became a net importer of corn. Should we pause for questions? Janice?
Yeah, go ahead.
The reason I'm asking. Like, before, when they decided to make the factories in Mexico, was Mexico excited about it initially?
It depends on who you're talking about. The question was when they started building the factories, and they started building those factories in 1965
Yeah.
at the end of the Bracero program and as a substitute for giving employment to Mexicans.
Yes.
And so it really depends on who you're talking about, because the elites in Mexico were the ones who negotiated NAFTA, not the people. There was tremendous opposition to NAFTA, both in the United States and in Mexico.
Thank you, sorry.
Yeah. So this is our mission. We formed it as we were learning these things. The Cross-Border Network for Justice and Solidarity educates about the imperialist policies of the United States and their effect on countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. We challenge Americans to recognize that corporate-driven globalization and militarism are major forces driving migration. We organize for human rights and economic justice by connecting working people and their families in solidarity across borders. That's our mission. Our slogan is we support workers across borders and who cross borders. And this is from one of the campaigns we did. This was a campaign at a factory in Rio Bravo, Mexico, called Duro Bag. And this was in 2000, where the workers went on strike because of really dangerous working conditions, roaches in their food, no seats, standing all day on concrete, things like that. We were part of an organization called the Coalition for Justice in Maquiladoras. And we advised them, I was at that rally where that picture was taken, we advised them to wait until we could prepare support for them, but they just walked out on strike. 150 workers got fired. And then we began a campaign to try to develop support for these workers. The workers' organizations in Mexico themselves tried to get an independent union because one of the big problems in Mexico had to do with the way the labor movement was run from the top down, basically, and very corrupt. It turned out that the major customer of that factory was Hallmark, and so we took it home to Hallmark. And that's one of our posters, the Hallmark Hall of Shame. We used to go down to the plaza in front of Hall's department store with a huge sign that showed the shacks that the workers lived in, calling it the Hallmark Hall of Shame. They didn't like it. They tried to get me fired for my job at UMKC, but didn't succeed. Also, the unions in Mexico, this photo shows how the unions in Mexico were supporting the workers as well. They eventually got an election for an independent union, which was then destroyed by both open ballots, no secret ballots, and thugs brought in called golpeadores from another union. So in the end, it failed, but they really raised some hell. And it was certainly educational for a lot of people. So this is a chart of the rise of Mexican-born population in the United States from 1850 to 2008. And what you see is in the era of neoliberalism, which begins in the 70s, you see this tremendous rise of migration. Okay, and why? Because people couldn't stay. They could no longer make a living in Mexico. And a lot of it was a result of these failed policies. By about 2005, social change in Mexico seemed really impossible. It became too dangerous as corruption and gangs spread, and we had to stop our work in Mexico. The organizations we were working with there just basically shut down. It was scary. This is a timeline. So I mentioned 1965, the Bracero program, which started the maquilas, the factories along the border, and they're now deep into Mexico. In 1971, Nixon initiated the war on drugs. The war on drugs turned out to be a war on the people. And, it was a failure here, there, and everywhere, basically, but it led to tremendous upsurges of violence, which also fed migration. Mexico had its first debt crisis in 1982, which led to austerity, privatization of many government functions, and also increased the urge to migrate. NAFTA happened in 1993. In 1994, Mexico had its second debt crisis, and that's when China joined the WTO, and we started bleeding jobs to China as well. So from that period, at least from the 1980s to the present, that neoliberal model imposed on Mexico and later on Central America by US State Department, USAID, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and the development banks. All of them come in and feast on whatever profits they can extract from poor countries. And all that you see is the debt of these countries keeps escalating, and the migration out from those countries keeps escalating as well. Especially after 9/11, then xenophobia or fear of foreigners begins to really grow in the United States because it's a very convenient political tool to use by people who think they can use it to win elections. And it invents a threat. Now, of course, this is an American tradition. We've been hating immigrants ever since before we became a country. But as I want you to look at what the real threat is. Okay, if you look at the purple line and you see it rising from the 70s on up, okay, it looks like a real threat. We've got all these people coming in here, right? Donald Trump calls it an invasion. But in fact, if you look at the blue-green line, that's immigrants as a percent of the American population. It's relatively flat. In fact, they're as a percent of the population, immigrants are 13.8% of our population today. At their height in 1890, they were over 14. And here's another chart showing the rise of Central American migration, which we see starting to pick up in the 1980s and really escalating after 2000. And the black line is Mexico, the gray line is Central America, the blue line are people from the Caribbean, Spanish-speaking Caribbean. But then if you look at the one on the right, of Latin American and Caribbean migration, which is the black line, compared to migration from Southeast and South Asia, which is also increasing. And then the green line is actually Africa. And there's another line there somewhere. The blue line is Europe. So you see the numbers of Europeans coming is decreasing. The numbers of everybody else is increasing, but particularly Latin Americans. And so the fear of migrants being churned up by political forces is mainly aimed at Latin Americans. We're going to see the immigration today from China is really on the rise, and we're going to start to see them shift over, I think, to demonizing the Chinese. So what about Central America? Okay, this is the Northern Triangle, which is Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. I'm throwing in Nicaragua because we've had substantial migration from Nicaragua too. And I want to just talk a little bit about their history. First off, US imperialism has dominated Central America since the 19th century, essentially since the Monroe Doctrine in 1816, I think it was. The US has invaded, attempted coups, blockaded, raided, bombed countries in Latin America 56 times since 1890. 30 of those have been in Central America, including coups or attempted coups in Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Panama, and El Salvador. That's Sam the Banana Man. He became the head of United Fruit Company, which of course caused coups. He overthrew the government of Honduras in 1916 because he didn't like the taxes that they were imposing on him. So here's another timeline. From 1960 to 1996, wars were happening all over Central America. 2004, CAFTA-DR, the Central American Free Trade Agreement with the Dominican Republic. 2009, coup in Honduras, okey-doked by the Obama administration. 2018, reemergence of death squads in Guatemala. The election of Nayib Bukele in El Salvador. And he was illegally elected just this year, re-elected just the year. In Honduras, you have the reign of Juan Orlando Hernandez, who was just convicted in court in New York City for narco trafficking after he stepped down from power. In 2022, his party lost the election in Honduras to Xiomara Castro. And Honduras returned to democracy. And in 2024, Bernardo Arevalo became the president of Guatemala, which was a huge change towards democracy in Guatemala. So we're seeing a possible reinstitution of democracy in Central America. But through this whole period, we see scores and scores and scores of Central Americans leaving because they can't stay. And since 2004, we've seen this upsurge of people from the Northern Triangle. We've seen more families of unaccompanied minors. And so why do families abandon lives and property to take a risky, arduous journey north despite threats of incarceration and separation when they get there? So the usual explanation is economics. It's poverty. They're poor. They want to come to the rich United States. It's crime. They're avoiding the gangs. It's young people looking for a better life. It's relatives who want to rejoin families who are already here. They don't have any hope for their country, and they want the American dream without being Americans. God damn it, they shouldn't be able to have that, right? But these explanations ignore history. The real roots of migration, not what Kamala Harris told us, are war. That's a picture of from the war in El Salvador. Lots of war. Coups and corruption. This guy, Bartolo Fuentes, a Honduran intellectual, said criminal structures are the foundation of the government. They create fake companies and NGOs to siphon off money. This is USAID money from the government. Services may be overpriced. A company will sell medicine to the government but there's no medicine. And then the government will blame the doctors and nurses for stealing the medicine. Corruption was so rampant under the narco dictatorship in Honduras, it was unbelievable. And our tax dollars were just flowing into the coffers of the oligarchs. Political instability. We saw this all over, but here's a picture from Guatemala against electoral fraud. Some of this should sound familiar because it's happening here too. The drug war and militarization. This is from Aguas in the Mosquitia of Honduras, where US helicopters staffed by people just out of Afghanistan opened fire on a passenger boat on a river, thinking they were drug traffickers, and killed a 14-year-old boy, 2 pregnant women, and the boat driver. And left everybody in the water while they searched for drugs down the river. That was just one example of how brutal the war on drugs became and how it corrupted local police and local military. Gangs. This one's from El Salvador. Bukele's been rounding up thousands and thousands of gang members and everybody else they can catch, I guess. And they blame the gangs a lot, but the gangs were formed in Los Angeles, and they were made by people who were deported, mainly Salvadorans who were deported from Los Angeles for lots of spurious reasons, and they had nothing. A lot of them didn't even speak Spanish, and they had no careers in El Salvador. They formed the gangs, and those gangs have spread throughout Central America. And into the United States again. Resource extraction. This is a mine in Guatemala that used to be a village. And was created with lots of murders of the people who lived there. If you have ever seen the movie Gold Fever, it's about Gold Corp, which is a Canadian corporation funded. And of course, free trade, debt restructuring, privatization. All of those things are the real roots of migration to the United States. And that's a picture of a maquila in Honduras. I think this one might be Gildan. Oh, no, it could be Hanes. They're big there. So Trump describes migrants as dangerous invaders, but people travel in caravans for safety. You know, to describe these people as an invasion is, you know, like, it's just incredibly irresponsible. Where's the guns? You know, are they hiding them in the strollers of the babies? It is not an army of invasions. These are people, these are desperate people who can't stay where they live, and they have this dream of America being a safer place. So there is an alternative to migrating, though, and there are many organizations in these countries that are encouraging people to stay. In fact, there's a whole movement called the Right to Stay Home. And you know, we saw this a lot in Honduras. That sign says, they've taken so much from us that we've even lost our fear. That was in a demonstration. And the Honduran people did successfully organize to defeat the National Party, which was the party of the narco traffickers. But it's a huge struggle, even with the new government. And the symbol in Honduras of the resistance is of course Berta Cáceres, who was assassinated in 2016. She was a leader of the Lenca people, which is an indigenous tribe in Honduras, but she was a leader of the resistance to the coup and to the militarization of the country. And there are many people in these countries who are struggling for democracy, and they deserve our support. And they deserve to have a US government that also doesn't impede the progress they're trying to make. So that's it for me. I'll take your questions later after the other presentations. And now I am turning it over to Genesis and Nicole.
Thank you, Judy. We'll get situated here with the other slide deck.
All right, hello everyone. So I will be starting on what I am looking at or what I'm seeing in the region of Kansas City at JVS, where I work at Jewish Vocational Service. We serve both residents from Kansas and Missouri.
Awesome. And then after Genesis' presentation, we'll pause for a short Q&A, but we still have a lot of content after that. We're going to make sure that Nicole and I help break down the U.S. immigration system. So we're going to do an immigration 101 and then go a little bit big picture to wrap up our session to talk about the national border state of play and give you all a better sense of the immigration and legal services landscape.
All right, so this is where I'll be starting. So serving the legal needs of Missouri and Kansas immigrant communities. So what we're seeing for immigrants in Missouri, 4% of Missouri residents are immigrants. Nearly half of all immigrants in Missouri are naturalized U.S. citizens. Of those, nearly 35,000 U.S. citizens in Missouri live with at least one family member who is undocumented, and Missouri is home to over 3,000 DACA recipients. So what we're seeing, this is just a graph showing the educational level and foreign-born population versus U.S.-born population. And then we're seeing, top industries with the highest share of immigrant workers. That would be in nail salons and other personal care services, as well as, in the factories of Western Kansas, we see that as well. So for the immigrants in Kansas, 7% of the Kansas residents are immigrants. Over 75,000 are undocumented immigrants. They live in Kansas, making it 35% of the immigrant population. So 1 in 11 Kansas workers is an immigrant. And, of course, immigrants in Kansas have contributed over $1 billion in taxes. So some of the challenges that we're seeing, that I'm seeing where I'm working is the lack of information. Most of the time, the clients that I'm seeing don't know where to go, don't know where to get information. A lot of the times, what I'm seeing and helping out with is just that people want information. Even if they don't end up contracting for the services that we offer, a lot of the time they just want information, because sometimes those clients aren't able or aren't eligible to apply for anything, but they leave knowing, okay, at least that they got that confirmation or that information that they know. Also, there aren't enough attorneys, unfortunately. Although you can be an immigration attorney, not all do, not all are practicing in court. And a lot of the times what we're seeing is that we need that representation in court. In Kansas City, there are over 300,000 cases, which would mean there's over 8,000 cases per attorney who do that type of defense in court. So that being, Kansas City courts are overwhelmed. And even if they do apply for asylum, they aren't going to court until 2028, or seeing their asylum trials being postponed till about 5 years. And then on top of that, there's just the resources aren't there. We need more funding, and so that's all we can ask for. So I work at JVS, Jewish Vocational Service. We don't just offer our services to people of the Jewish faith. We are actually an agency. So our mission to engages, encourages, and empowers people to achieve social, cultural, economic integration. Our immigration program staff work one-on-one with refugees, asylum seekers, and immigrants to apply for immigration benefits. And all services are provided at a low no rate. And yeah, so if you have any questions, let me know.
Yeah, Hennessy, so we have, and then Nicole, feel free to jump in too with these. There's a question in the Q&A. If you applied for asylum in Kansas, where would you go to court?
Most of the time is in Kansas City.
Is there any situation where someone may be sent elsewhere, or speak a little bit to that?
There is, when you're at the border, you usually give them an address, so they'll assign you that address wherever you're at. But so if that person gave another address, then it could be that their court is somewhere else. But if they're in Kansas City, then I would suggest finding an attorney to be able to change that location to Kansas City, to where the closest that you live.
And is there any difference between someone that applies in Kansas versus Missouri, or any advantages?
Well, no, not really. Like, especially with Kansas and Missouri, you'll be assigned to the same court. So there's really not a difference.
Hennessy, can you speak a little bit about how JVS's work is supported, how y'all are funded?
We're funded mostly through grants. Our department, since we're kind of out of that a little bit, since we help everyone, not just people who are assigned to JVS. So we can help everyone.
There's a question asking us to dig in a little bit deeper on asylum and what people's rights are. We're going to cover that in a little bit, so just pause for a sec.
I will say most of my cases, like 80% of my cases, are asylum defense cases. So I'm seeing mostly more from the Hispanic population, but also I'm starting to see more from everywhere else around the world.
And a general question, Hennessy, can you speak about the right to an attorney for folks in going through the asylum process or any other removal defense posture?
Yeah, I mean, the right, all citizens or all people have a right to have an attorney, in court. It's just sometimes it's difficult to find one that offers those services, and especially in Kansas City. So, and even if we don't, see the case through, there's still a right to be able to have some kind of representation in court. So even if it's just filing a motion, some attorneys will be able to do that.
And I would just add that that's in contrast to the criminal justice system. So there are no public defenders in immigration court. So agencies like Hennessy's and mine nonprofits come into that space to sort of provide representation for folks. So while you have a right, or immigrants have a right to representation in those proceedings, it's at their own cost. So the government does not provide representation for anyone as opposed to how it would be like in a criminal proceeding.
Then a general question for either of you, and not necessarily that your organizations help people apply for public benefits, but could you speak very generally about how you navigate these conversations with mixed status families? So, for example, a undocumented parents but have U.S. citizen children, and just the general conversations or advice that you all give them to navigate access to public benefits.
For us at JVS, we have a department that helps, mixed status families. Usually those mixed status though may have some type of like a parole status where they're able to apply for those benefits. And then at times we're able, on our department, our legal side for immigration, we are able to help them. Nicole, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
No, similarly, we also have a department that assists with public benefits applications. I think generally, and we'll get into this a little bit more, undocumented immigrants or folks who are maybe in proceedings like asylum, generally, especially in Kansas and Missouri, aren't eligible for public benefits themselves. But as we mentioned, mixed status families are those in which there may be undocumented immigrants in the household, or U.S. citizens in the household, or folks with green cards. And so sometimes some family members can be eligible for things like food stamps or Medicaid or other benefits. And so that's the kind of thing that the immigrant themselves may not be applying for, but that their household could benefit from. I think that maybe the question was alluding to or getting at that there's often like a fear of immigrants that if their household receives some sort of benefit, that they could be prejudiced or punished down the road in their immigration case. Thankfully, the current state of affairs with what we would call public charge, or if you've heard anyone talk about public charge, during the past administration, there was like big pushes to limit or to sort of punish immigrants in that context. The important thing to note, I think the like general advice that we tend to give is that U.S. citizens, so be they children or whoever, if you have U.S. citizenship, you are eligible for benefits, period. And they can't hold the receipt of public benefits for those who are eligible against an immigrant. Obviously, if the immigrant receives a benefit or applies for something they're not eligible for and takes advantage of it, there are issues there. But if it's a U.S. citizen receiving the benefit, there is no issue for an immigrant household member.
Thank you, Nicole. Next question, Lucy, can you speak about the cost for someone to apply for asylum? And I think it would be helpful for folks to like know costs associated if you went the private route versus the nonprofit route.
Yeah, so for us, since it's technically in 2 stages, we're allowed to not charge the whole thing up front. So many attorneys will charge the whole fee. So it could be like $10,000, $7,000. But we understand the cost associated. For us, we split it in 2, so it'll just be that the filing the asylum application in court, which runs about $1,500, and then once the trial starts, which would be later on down the road, like another 2-3 years, then we'll start at $2,000. But depends on what we need to do in court.
And those, just to confirm, those costs are to be able to get legal assistance, right? It's because your organization, I'm assuming, doesn't have a flurry of grants that cover this work, so you all have to sustain your work through nominal fees.
Yes.
I've heard, like you mentioned, private attorneys to actually meet their full costs, charging upwards of $10,000 or more.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's even sometimes them figuring out how to work with the families. But these are very resource intensive cases and take a lot of people power and a lot of resources to put together, which is part of the challenge of trying to serve the overwhelming need that's coming to our agencies.
Exactly.
Any questions in the audience? We can only see the questions being posted in Zoom.
Yeah, we are getting some questions here. So Maria says she works with undocumented that receive a court date.
They can apply for food stamp.
But they can't apply?
No, I'm asking if, because I have a undocumented family, they came and they already have the work permit and the social security. But they was wonder if they apply for benefits, it will take their process.
So the question is if they've received a court date and they have their social security, can they apply for benefits without it affecting their case?
I don't know, Hennessy, if you want to say anything else. I would say the receipt of public benefits it wouldn't affect the ultimate decision that a judge would make. The judge doesn't take into account any of that, like if they are applying for asylum. However, and I don't know Kansas law, I know in Missouri, that person wouldn't be eligible for any public benefits like food stamps or Medicaid or anything like that. Maybe different in other states. Looks like maybe we lost Tennessee's. So I'm not sure if anyone else has Kansas specific knowledge. My guess would be it's similar to Missouri from what I know about Kansas and how friendly the policy landscape is there for immigrants.
I have another question, because migrants, we receive people from, they just arrived, but they came like, from Mexico, they say, we was waiting on the border for cross, the border and without permit. What is that? Is that asylum, or what kind of, why is different the process? How a person can grant like an asylum, because we hear from different situations every day there.
So
Well,
go ahead, Luis.
no, well, we're about to do a deeper dive on asylum, refugee status, and just even other forms of relief. So hopefully we'll be able to answer your question. And if we don't address it in the next portion of the presentation, we can circle back on that question. But it's very complicated, and that's why. I'll simply say that many people think that just being allowed to enter the U.S. was a grant of asylum, which is where the misconception starts. And those of us that do a lot of education on the southern side of the border in Tijuana, Juarez, etc., have to debunk a lot of those myths. It's like just getting across the border is one step, but you have a very long journey. And, in common just community speak, many folks say, oh, I was granted asylum, but I was like, were you really? And that's when a legal advocate would come in and really look at all the paperwork, look at the entire case, look what has happened in the situation to figure out where they are in the process. And as you heard from Hennessy earlier, these processes may take many years. And so if they recently arrived, it's very likely that they have not been granted asylum.
And we did just see an answer in the chat that said they're not eligible for benefits on either Kansas or Missouri side. But yeah, since Tennessee's left, we will continue with the rest of our presentation. Continue to submit your questions either in the chat on the webinar or on the Slack page. If you need that code, I'll be right up front here. Thank you.
Great. Well, as Luis mentioned, we are now sort of going to dig into the U.S. immigration system. Thanks for allowing Hennessy to do her part beforehand, although you'll see here it might have been more logical to do this first. We're grateful that she could join us for that first part of that first hour. So just a little background about my organization. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are located in St. Louis, on the other side of the state, and we work with low-income immigrants to overcome barriers to justice. Our principal service is legal representation in immigration cases, but as I mentioned just a couple of questions ago, we also have a client support services department, so do case management, and then community education outreach such as this. So we can do the next slide. So how the United States immigration system works, some of these themes that Judy led us off with, you will see that there are ways in which U.S. immigration policy really does sort of put forth certain values in theory based on the reunification of families, admitting immigrants with skills that are valuable to the US economy, protecting refugees, and promoting diversity. That would be what they sort of say. And, you know, academic discussions of what this is supposed to be. I think in reality, you will see that there are pretty racist origins of this system throughout the last couple centuries as it has developed. Really yucky things in our past in regards to eugenics and ableism. And of course, that sort of perennial discussion of the good versus bad immigrant binary and which immigrants we want and which immigrants we don't want. Next slide. So types of immigration statuses, this is very complex. As you'll know, this whole presentation is sort of the 101 version of this. I'm sure there are things that could be debated, but we hope it gives you a little bit of an overview. So you'll hear the term sometimes non-immigrant, which sounds interesting because I think that colloquially we would say immigrants are people who were not born in the United States, right? Foreign-born folks sometimes is a word that's used as well. However, there are immigration statuses that are non-immigrant immigration statuses. So someone who's here on a student visa is a non-immigrant or a non-immigrant status holder, because in immigration law, that word sort of immigrant implies an intent to stay indefinitely or a permanent status. But these non-immigrant statuses, students, tourists, you know, people who are here on business or sports players, those are temporary stays. And so we refer to them, or the Immigration and Nationality Act refers to them as non-immigrants. Immigrants, however, are folks who either are in permanent status or on a path to permanent status. So lawful permanent residents, this is going to be the term that we use for green card holders or people who are allowed to stay in the United States permanently because they have permanent residence. Refugees, we'll talk more about refugees, how they come into the country, but refugees are admitted as refugees and are on a path to permanent status. Asylees, so this is once someone's asylum case is granted, we refer to them as an asylee. So they've already been granted that status, and again, they're on a path to that permanent status. Once folks have been in lawful permanent resident status for a certain amount of time, is another thing we'll talk about, they can become naturalized US citizens. And then of course, there is another sort of blanket category of folks who are undocumented or unauthorized. Next. Again, a simplified sort of chart so you can kind of see when I talk about the kind of work that we do. Nonprofits are generally providing immigration legal services in these first two columns, so humanitarian cases and family reunification cases. There are also clearly lots of people who come from other countries to the United States in the employment category. And then of course, there are people who enter either crossing the border without inspection, so that EWI is entry without inspection, or there are folks who enter on a non-immigrant visa, as we talked about, a student or a tourist, and overstay the amount of time that they were allowed to be in the United States. So those folks, although they did not enter unlawfully, they are out of status after that stay expires, and so they are categorized as unauthorized or undocumented in this sort of scheme. I think we can go to the next one. So what are ways that folks, a little bit more information about ways that folks come legally to the United States? This, you clearly cannot see all of the detail on here, but I think that's kind of the point, is that it's very complicated. I encourage you to actually look up this cartoon, or maybe we can share the link in like the post presentation attendee email. But it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but basically shows you that there are very specific paths on which one can travel. None of these paths involve someone from outside of our country saying, I'd really like to go live in the United States. I'm going to apply, send in my application, pay a fee, and have a chance at getting approved. There is no such path. All of the ways in which someone can come legally to the United States with an eye to staying permanently involve a connection to a US citizen or a connection to a US business. So an employment-based application or a family-based application. And then, as we mentioned, those humanitarian options. So, like I said, this is complex. I'd encourage you to look it up. It's pretty silly, but also really illustrative to the difficulties. So in regards to the family-based immigration system, this is another thing that is very complex, but you hear about it sometimes in the news. There are certain categories of family relationships by which you can obtain legal status in the United States. So spouses, children, in some cases, well, for US citizens, siblings and parents. But you'll notice not uncles, not cousins, not other sort of more attenuated family relationships, only those certain categories of family relationships. This chart is very confusing, but it shows you that every category except for immediate relatives of US citizens, so this is spouses and minor children, there's no wait time. And there's a wait time of the processing times, but there's no line for those. These, however, are set. There are numbers per year, caps on the amount of people who can come in each category listed in this chart. And then those numbers are subject to per country limits. So only X number of siblings of US citizens can come from the Philippines in any given year. And so these dates that you see on this chart are showing you that currently in June of 2024, people who are, for example, siblings, that's F4, sibling category from, so I'm a US citizen and I have a sibling who is in Mexico. If I applied for them in February of 2001, they would be getting their visa right now. So 23 years later, they would be able to come to the United States with an immigrant visa, so with permanent residence. So it shows you that that backlog and those wait times are sort of the line that people are referring to, even inadvertently, because they don't understand when they say, well, why don't they just get in line? Okay, so this is the line. If you fit in that very specific category, you can get in this, what is at this moment a 23-year wait line. Again, incredibly complex, lots of sort of nuance here, but just to give you an idea, I like to talk about this, even though it's complex, because I think you hear that get in line phrasing so often that it's important to understand what that actually means. This is a bit of it's for illustration purposes. For immigration attorneys in the audience, you'll know that this isn't like necessarily the ins and outs or the way this would play out, but for purposes of illustration, I'd like to go through this. So the F1 preference category are for unmarried sons and daughters, so those are not minors, of US citizens. Okay, so if I came to the United States, I became a US citizen, but I have an adult child in my home country. So that's why this example doesn't really work, because you'll notice that my Claire and Susanna are both 9 when they submit their visa application. Okay, we're going to walk through it just so you can see. Okay, so in 2002, Susanna's from Mexico. Her mother, who's living in the United States and is a US citizen, submits an application for her when she's 9. Susanna in 2024 would get her immigration or her immigrant visa, and she's now 31 years old. So how long did Susanna wait? A really long time, 22 years. Claire, however, same situation. Her mother's in the United States and is a US citizen, and she applies in 2015. And in 2024, she receives her immigrant visa and she's 18. So again, forgive me, immigration attorneys, for the categories. But a technicality showing that the difference between certain countries' wait times and others, and you'll note the primary difference here, are these the good immigrants or the bad immigrants? You see how this is all baked into our immigration system, and how those lines are really very different depending on what part of the world you're from. Okay, we'll go through this one quickly. F2B, unmarried adult children of green card holders. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's an annual limit for that category. So there's only 26,000 some unmarried adult children of green card holders who can enter in any given fiscal year. And then there's a per country limit. So for Mexico, they get 1,800-ish. So someone who's applying today, we gave the example of someone who applied in the past and is getting their visa today. That was like, 23-year wait, an 18-year wait. In order to, if someone walks into my office today and says, I have my green card, I would like to apply for my unmarried adult child who lives in Mexico, I could tell them, here's how we figure out how long your son or daughter might wait. We look at the number of applications pending. So this is the whole line that they want you to get in, divided by the annual limit. There's the math there on the slide. And it would be about 66 years for the unmarried adult child, my unmarried adult child, if I'm a green card holder, to come to the United States. So these are pretty devastating numbers. And the reason why many folks might decide to rejoin their family members and enter without a visa, if that's the line that you're faced with waiting in, if you're lucky enough to have a spot in that line. So I think as those of you who work with undocumented immigrants, there are certainly incredible amounts of knowledge and wherewithal and ways that undocumented immigrants survive when they make it to our country and aren't provided with, for example, public benefits or other things upon arrival. The reality is, I hope you can see from both that sort of cartoonish chart and those wait time, visa bulletin information. The reality is that there's little to no opportunity for most undocumented immigrants to adjust their status. People aren't not filling out a form. People aren't not paying a fine. It's not just they haven't tried hard enough to get legal status. The law doesn't allow them to do so. Next slide. We touched on mixed status families. I think this is important. This is nationally. Okay, yes. So the first chart or graphic is nationally. Number of U.S. citizen children living with at least one undocumented family member. So any family member. And then the second circle chart is with an undocumented parent. So a lot of 4 million plus children in the United States who are U.S. citizens because they were born here, have an undocumented person in their home. And then I did have Missouri numbers and I don't have Kansas ones. I apologize, but you can see it's a little smaller of a percentage, but a reality for many in our communities. Okay, so path to citizenship. I've touched on the fact that most undocumented immigrants probably do not have a viable option to obtain any sort of legal status. But one thing I like to talk about in these types of presentations is you often hear, oh, well, why didn't they apply for citizenship? Apply for citizenship or become a citizen or become a citizen. Really important to note that becoming a citizen or applying for citizenship is like a very small piece of the immigration process. And obtaining legal status has there can be lots of different ways to do that. But anyone who is becoming a citizen, it is the final destination on the immigration journey. But if you say someone is applying for citizenship, they have definitely had to have been a lawful permanent resident or had their green card for somewhere between 3 and 5 years, depending on how they obtained their green card. So citizenship, obviously, as I mentioned, is the end of the immigration process for an individual. That's, you can't do anything beyond that. And does grant really important rights, but not until you've had a green card, lawful permanent resident status for several years can you apply to become a citizen. Excuse me. That's just a little chart about it. Once you are eligible to apply for citizenship, this is how you might do that. It involves learning some civics and history that many of us maybe couldn't pass the test if we had to. And then proving that you've been in the United States in that status, that you haven't left and abandoned your permanent residence, and then being able to go apply and be interviewed and take an oath to become a citizen. And now we're gonna sort of jump back, as we talked about at the beginning of the presentation, to folks who are seeking protection in the United States. So we talk a lot about recent arrivals, or sort of in this humanitarian category. So we're going to dig in a little bit to that. Excuse me. So refugee status. We often hear, oh, coming as refugees, and we have all these refugees on the southern border. Really important to note that there is a difference between refugees and asylees. So refugee status is something that is granted outside of the United States. And when a refugee arrives to the United States, they are allowed in, often on a plane, and they receive a social security number, they receive work authorization, they do have access to benefits and support, financial support and otherwise upon arrival. And then they're able to adjust to permanent residence, so change their status from refugee status, which is indefinite, to green card holder after 1 year of being in the United States. And then they can become citizens 5 years after that, but can petition for family members immediately once they arrive as refugees or anywhere along that path. So on the southern border, those are just some photos. And go ahead. Asylum seekers, however, most folks that we see here in the in St. Louis, and I believe, you know, similarly in Kansas City, are coming from Central America and South America. So Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and more recently, more folks from Colombia, Venezuela, Haiti, and also starting to see some from Brazil. They come for many reasons. The ways in which they can apply for protection have to be limited to certain categories. So political persecution, discrimination or persecution based on membership in a group, like being a member of the LGBTQ community, an Indigenous person, women who've experienced certain forms of domestic violence. Fleeing gang violence and economic hardship are very legitimate reasons for coming to the United States, but are not often ways in which one can ultimately win an asylum case. You can go to the next slide. So, as I mentioned, refugees have received lawful status outside of the United States. They have fled their country. They have landed somewhere where there's a UNHCR, so a United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees office. They've been interviewed and vetted, and they get approved as refugees and then are assigned to a resettlement country. So when they've gotten to the United States, that's how that happens. Asylum, however, is something that you can only apply for once you are in the United States. You can't go to the consulate in your country. You can't go even to a UNHCR office. I mean, if you aren't eligible to be processed as a refugee, you must set foot in the United States and request asylum. You cannot get on a plane in another country and say, oh yeah, I'm just gonna go and, well, they'll check my paperwork at the airport when I get to Chicago or Dallas or wherever, and there I'm gonna tell them I want asylum. No, because the airline has to check documents and immigration paperwork from your point of origin and have to assure that you won't be turned back when you get to the border. So this is why many people make arduous journeys to arrive at our southern border, whether they're from Latin America or beyond. It is often the only way in which folks can request protection in the United States. So as you see, and as I mentioned, they must be subject to persecution. So persecution is a serious term. It means severe harm, can be cumulative. The convention reason is what I was referring to. The persecution that the person faced or will face in the future must be based on their race, their religion, their nationality, their membership in a particular social group, as I mentioned a couple examples of that, or their political opinion. They have to apply, which means actually submit the asylum application. It's a 12-page form. It's in English. It has to be submitted and received appropriately within the first year that they are in the United States. This is really important for border entrance. So people who do make it across the southern border and are given a court date, if their court date is in 2 or 3 years, it doesn't matter. They have to submit their asylum application to the correct place before the first anniversary of being in the US. They have to prove that either their government was doing the persecution, so was the persecutor, or their persecutor was someone that their government was unable or unwilling to control. And they must be credible. So it's a really complex sort of analysis that the adjudicator, an immigration judge, or asylum officer undergoes with asylum cases. Sometimes you may hear of, and we're going to go in a little more in detail into like the current situation on the border, but sometimes asylum seekers are interviewed at the border in something called a credible fear interview. Sometimes asylum seekers are detained by ICE, whether it's for a short time or months. The government has the sort of legal authority to detain people who are seeking asylum. Realistically, there's not a lot of space or resources to detain, and that's why you often see folks allowed in to pursue their asylum cases from our communities. And I mentioned the thing about the 1-year deadline. Once an asylum seeker has submitted that application and can prove that it's on file, they become eligible for work authorization, but not until the asylum application has been pending for 5 months. So you've seen this with a lot of the folks who were bused, for example, to Chicago or New York, where not only is it hard to find representation to fill out an asylum application, but then there's still a 5-month wait after that in order to apply for work authorization. Becoming an asylee is difficult. It's very difficult, hard to win an asylum case. We've talked about how long it can take. Genesis referred to it. I think we are seeing closer to 5 to 7 years. She mentioned there's 300,000 pending cases. No, I think it's 40. Anyways, there's a ton. Maybe Jessica's in the audience, maybe she knows. In Kansas City. So our court as well for St. Louis, our venue is in Kansas City. There's not an immigration court in St. Louis. And the judges, there's only 3 of them. There's tens of thousands of cases. And these are the statistics for the denials of asylum cases. So nationwide, it's somewhere between maybe 65 to 70% of asylum claims are denied. Our judges in Kansas City are incredibly strict, and it's closer to 90, I would say, probably on average between the 3 of them now. So not favorable. You may see, and it's a little less so in the last couple of years, but many asylum seekers, many folks who have recently arrived crossing the southern border are placed, it's called alternatives to detention. So I alluded to the fact that the government has sort of the authority to detain asylum seekers or people who enter the United States and are in proceedings. And as an alternative to detention, they often put folks on what's called an intensive supervision appearance program. As I said, we often saw a few years ago, most people were placed on ankle monitors, which can be really detrimental to health and mental health. Less so now, but still usually reporting with immigration via sometimes a cell phone application or other ways of surveillance during the pendency of their court case. You might also see folks coming to our communities who are children who arrived, and we certainly avoid the term here that you see on the slide of alien, but in the immigration code, they are referred to as unaccompanied alien child or unaccompanied children. And these are children who come to the US either on their own or with a family member who is not a parent. So sometimes an older sibling or an aunt or uncle, they may travel to the US without a biological parent, and as such be processed as unaccompanied children. So a little bit about how we talked about the recent arrivals. They're coming to Kansas City, they're coming to St. Louis. What happens then? So those folks have not been granted asylum, as we mentioned. They are in asylum proceedings or they're in removal proceedings. They can apply for an asylum as a defense to that removal or to that deportation. And they these are civil proceedings. It's administrative law. This is not in the judicial branch. It's in the executive branch in an administrative court. As we mentioned too, there are no public defenders. So folks can try to get an attorney, but there's incredibly limited resources in regards to legal representation. Sometimes their first court appearance is around 6 months after they arrive. Often I'm seeing now, folks with their first court date in 2027. So they may wait a very long time to actually appear in court. After they've appeared in court and filed, for example, an asylum application, they will be assigned to a trial, which Genesis was talking about. And those are also many years in the future, especially with the volume of cases at our current court. If an immigration judge says no or denies an asylum application, there is an appeals process. So folks can appeal that decision, and that process can take another 2 to 4 years. They can't be removed during the time that appeal is pending. So as you can see, people really do put down roots and become parts of our community when they're here for this long. So I think it's really important that you all are learning more about this, and we're grateful for your work with folks. Interior enforcement, so this would be like you hear about ICE, or you hear about ICE raids, or immigrant members of our communities who've been here for a long time being picked up by immigration. That's what we refer to interior enforcement. So how does someone get deported if you didn't, if you're not a recent entrant? So this is sort of the other folks. Excuse me, I apologize for my throat today. So no one can be removed, at least for now, from the United States without, quote, due process. So the Constitution assures some level of due process. So if someone, an undocumented person, has never received an order of deportation, either from an immigration judge, sometimes from the border, or like failed to appear at an immigration hearing, they cannot be deported. So if they are out of status, they have no legal status, even if they've been here for decades, they get a chance. They are placed in removal proceedings and get a chance to see a judge and present a defense to their deportation. So I think that this is an important piece of information, because I think sometimes we hear from community members that there's a lot of fear. And it's not that we would expect you to be able to know, does someone have a deportation order or no? But most folks are never going to be subject to deportation like from one day to the next, right? Like you're not going to wake up in the morning and then all of a sudden they're deported. If they have an immigration history that includes a deportation order, a removal order, it's possible, but most people are not in that situation. Most people have never seen an immigration judge, and they get a chance to do that before they could ever be removed from the US. Next. Common needs that we see, so back to recent arrivals. Folks are required to change their address. So they may have given an address at the border and then are able to obtain their own housing or move. They are required to do that. They are required to appear with ICE as they were told. So if they were instructed to go in to local ICE, so there's one in Kansas City, there's one in Springfield, there's one in St. Louis, and sort of be put on one of those reporting programs, they need to do that. As I mentioned, so many people need representation for asylum. Really important that folks not miss their court dates. If you miss just one immigration court hearing, the judge is required to issue an in absentia removal order. So that means you did not appear, but we issued a removal order. So really dire consequences to missing court. And we know that folks struggle without work authorization and social security numbers. I just wanted to touch briefly, and how am I doing on time? We're okay, Luis? Okay. I would touch briefly just on social security numbers and ITIN numbers. So if you've heard of this, or if you may, individual taxpayer identification number is an ITIN. It is a number that was created so that people who are not eligible for social security numbers, undocumented immigrants, for example, or folks who haven't received work authorization yet, that they can file tax returns. So they have to present a passport, a valid passport. These numbers look like social security numbers, but they start with a 9. So you'll often see on a tax return, like, oh, but this person filed taxes, like, are they using a fake social? If it starts with a 9, that's an ITIN number. Thankfully, I think the financial industry has sort of stepped it up in regards to financial services available for ITIN holders. So those folks can often open bank accounts or even get a mortgage. But in Missouri, and I'm pretty sure in Kansas, no access to driver's licenses. An ITIN doesn't give you permission to work. It just, again, is used for filing taxes if you by chance have worked. And then social security numbers, on the other hand, do allow you to apply in our states for driver's licenses or state IDs, and do allow you to work if your work permit is valid.
Nicole, I can jump here to give your
Great.
throat a rest. For this other document that you see on your screen, we call this an NTA or a notice of appear. We wanted to share an example because many folks that you may be trying to figure out what is going on in their situation, most likely if they cross through the border or are trying to figure out how to navigate the immigration system, will have a document that looks like this. If they do have a notice to appear, it essentially means that they are most likely than not in removal proceedings. The charging document, the document that the government gives an individual to say that their process in the court system has started. And there's some key things here to help people that people need to know. Most often than not, there's confusion about the A number. The A number, the alien number, is an 8 to 9 digit immigration identification number that can be found towards the top of most immigration documents. In the NTA, it's towards the top right. It's called file number. And then which immigration court will be hearing this case is towards the bottom of the document. So as you can see, just like from this example, if English is not your first language or even your second language, this is a very complicated document that people are often trying to figure out, what does this mean for me? And once again, the folks are put in a defensive posture. Applying for asylum is a form of relief to defend yourself from being removed. It's as soon as you enter the country and you are a request to be put in the asylum process, it's not like you're being given the benefit of the doubt that you're going to qualify and you're going to be put through and hopefully make it through. You're automatically being told by the government, you're not allowed to be here. We are going to remove you unless you can convince us otherwise and make it through all the loops and hoops. There are immigration court websites and 1-800 number that you see on the screen where folks can call in, and if they have their A number, can enter the A number, and it will give them essentially their next upcoming date with court or what's happening in their case. Link to that automated case information hotline is on your screen, along with a 1-800 number. The number one resource I like to share and that many folks share is from an organization called ASAP, the Asylum Advocacy Services Project, and they have a lot of great resources for individuals to be able to understand the system themselves. We call these pro se resources or resources where individuals are going to be self-representing themselves or having to navigate the system mostly on their own, because that's kind of our starting point. Most individuals are going to have to figure this out on their own, are going to have to move forward without very much help because of the lack of support that exists and resources that exist. ASAP does an amazing job at providing and breaking down different parts of the process, whether it be changing your address with the courts, or how to read an NTA, or how to call the 1-800 number, things like that in various languages. So I encourage you all to use their resources and share those with individuals that you're working with, as there's a lot that is useful on their website. The online detainee locator is helpful for individuals that are trying to find someone that has been detained by ICE. This could also be someone that was came across the southern border but ended up in detention, in prolonged detention under ICE custody. That website will ask for some identifying information like name, country of origin, birth date for individuals. And the challenging part of using the system is you can't misspell the name, or if there was a typo with the name when they were apprehended, the system might not pop up the person, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not detained. So it's a helpful starting point for just someone to be able to find a family member if they're trying to figure out where they are in detention. But only, wouldn't treat it as like the final answer, and there might be additional searching that needs to happen if nothing is popping up with different variances of names or different typings of the name. And then for locating unaccompanied minors, so in a situation where a family member knows that a minor crossed the southern border, and they don't know where that individual that minor is. Most likely they're going to be in government custody or through the Office of Refugee and Resettlement. This number is the national hotline to locate those unaccompanied minors. There's going to be a lot of assurances put in place and screening that happens to make sure that individuals that are calling actually have a tie to the minor, to prevent trafficking situations. But if a family member and someone that's trying to reunify with a minor that is in U.S. custody that was crossed through the southern border, this is the starting point, is this 1-800 number that you see on the screen, and a social worker will be connected with that family member to talk through the next steps of reunification, which could be lengthy, but definitely a good resource for people to know and have. So we've been talking about how difficult, it is to get refugee status or asylee status, and just don't want to end the 101 without talking about a few other forms of immigration relief. These aren't as common for recent arrivals, but maybe more helpful for individuals that have been undocumented in our country for many years. One that we want to briefly touch on is temporary protective status, which is a status provided to nationals of specific designated countries. Folks that receive this temporary protective status will get a work permit and protection from deportation. The challenge is that they just will be in constant limbo because it usually is granted for a few years, and it has to be renewed every time that it's going to be expiring. And there's always a question of whether or not that temporary protected status for that particular country will continue to be expanded after it reaches its expiration. Why does temporary protective status exist, or what's the reasoning behind it? It's intended to be associated with countries confronting an ongoing armed conflict, or like an example is a civil war that poses a serious threat to the personal safety of returning, or a big environmental disaster like a big earthquake, hurricane, or epidemic, or an extraordinary or temporary conditions. Foreign nationals from those countries who are in the United States at the time the U.S. government made the designation might be eligible for TPS. As of March 31, 2023, there were approximately over 600,000 people with TPS living in the United States. In addition, an estimated over 660,000 people may be eligible for TPS under 7 redesignations announced by the Biden since that date. So it's really complicated for individuals to know whether or not they may be TPS holders, and yet another important reason why it may be helpful to have a screening. And just the next slide shows you how complex it can get. These are some of the TPS designations that have been made for specific countries, for very specific reasons. And once again, the individuals would have to have been in the United States already when these designations happened. The other one that is obviously very well known by advocates that work with immigrants is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, which was an executive policy for certain individuals who came to the United States as children who meet a series of long list of requirements. They have to come forward and apply for relief from deportation for 2-year periods. This is a 2-year deferment of deportation. Also grants eligibility for a work permit and opens a possibility for travel abroad through a concept called advanced parole, where individuals who already have deferred action status notify the government that they would like to leave the country. That the reasons are limited, though. You can't just leave for wanting to leave. It has to be tied to an educational reason, or a hardship reason. And so you'll see many documented individuals that have been able to leave and reconnect with their families through the advanced parole. And that's definitely a case-by-case situation, and there are risks involved even with prior grant of being able to leave the country, and should be discussed with an attorney or legal advocate before making that decision. We know that DACA has helped, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals has helped many people, but it just isn't the solution that our communities need. Program has been closed to new applicants effectively since September of 2017. So since then, it's been mostly individuals that are applying for renewal. And as such, the individuals who were quote unquote denoted as young dreamers, or cohort of young people, are continuing to, get older and have deeper ties to our communities, and continue to be in this limbo status without really knowing when they're going to be able to be put on a path to citizenship. Part of that, as you all know, is it's very political, and DACA is under constant attack. And election after election, it continues to be something that that folks with this status have to be worried about whether or not they're going to be any changes made to the program, as it's not protected in any way, shape, or form by any law. It was created by executive action. Taking a step back, preaching to the choir here, but immigration status definitely matters, and it affects the eligibility for public benefits, access to health insurance and healthcare, eligibility for a driver's license depending on the state, ability to get a job, ability to receive financial aid for college, and it shouldn't impact access to education. But obviously there'd be obstacles for higher education if someone can't afford it or can't find any support that they're eligible for. And to wrap up our 101 session, we just want to remind folks that even those that are undocumented or in some sort of limbo status are protected by the Constitution, and all immigrants have rights. You'll just highlighting some here that you see on the screen. Everyone has the right to remain silent. They have the right to speak to an attorney before answering questions, but as we keep talking about, the challenge is whether or not they can afford one or have access to some of the few nonprofit attorneys that exist. So many folks, even though they have this right, are forced to navigate the system on their own. If they're not a U.S. citizen, they have the right to call the consulate of their home country. Immigration and police must let the consulate visit or speak with you, and have someone come to speak with you. They have the right to deny the police entrance to your home if they don't have a warrant. A warrant is not valid unless it displays the correct name and address and is signed by a judge. They don't have to sign anything that they don't understand and have that right to have a copy of all the immigration papers that the government holds on their case. So it's always, I know that JVS does this and Mika Project does this, even for individuals that are in limbo or don't have a pathway to any sort of status. It's reminding them that they do have rights. They can assert those rights if they ever find themselves in a situation where they're confronted by law enforcement or government. On these two short sections, first I just want to give you all an update on what's happening at the southern border, and then wrap us up by doing a quick landscape of the immigration legal services community. So many of you heard on June 5th, President Biden took executive action to further block access to asylum for most people arriving at the southern border. It generally means that folks that don't come through the port of entry will not be eligible for asylum. If the government will have the ability to remove them to their home country or a third country if it's not possible to remove them to their home country. They could face at least a 5-year ban on re-entry and can confront possible criminal charges. What the ban essentially has said is that there's now a quota of how many encounters can happen at the U.S. southern border before this ban is lifted. So this asylum ban will take effect once immigration officials encounter an average of 2,500 people per day over a 7-day period. What we think this means is essentially the ban is going to be indefinite unless it gets challenged in the courts. The quota really has nothing to do, as you know, with people, whether or not the legitimacy of people's claims to asylum, such as the fear for their lives in their home countries, and will definitely result in vulnerable people being sent back to danger and persecution without even a chance to seek safety. A little bit more on the asylum ban that we want to share with folks is that people have the legal right to seek asylum under both U.S. and international law. The ban abandons the United States obligations and historic promise to protect people fleeing persecution. Biden, unfortunately, is using the same authority President Trump did under the Muslim ban or the African bans that we saw under his administration, which the federal court struck down as unlawful. The new ban is illegal because it will result in people being deported to countries where they face persecution or torture. This is forbidden under U.S. and international law, and advocates will be taking the government to court over this. So we are expecting this to be litigated, but that also just means that it will further create confusion in our communities, and as it moves through that court system, may impact what's happening on the ground in different ways. One of the key things that also is a result of this ban is what we're calling the SHAP test. So immigration officials will no longer ask about migrants' fear of returning to their country. Instead, it will require migrants to proactively tell a border agent they are afraid to return to their home country, and depends entirely on the border agent they've encountered listening to and believing them. For those of you that want to take action, there's many ways that you can, probably including locally. I'm throwing one petition that's being circulated by our partners at Human Rights First. We'll make sure we're circulating this link with the materials for today's presentation. But we encourage all of us to stand up and be loud to tell the Biden administration to reverse its new border proclamation. So the reality of newly arrived immigrants at our southern border is that continued deterrence-only policies will always have a significant impact on Black, Brown, Indigenous, disabled, and LGBTQ+ people seeking asylum. The reality is also there will be inconsistencies in implementation of policies at the southern border. We've seen this in during the pandemic or even previous to the pandemic. Things don't get implemented uniformly across the border. So there could be situations where on parts of the border, folks, because of large numbers, are actually being allowed into the country. And the ban will play out later on in the process once they're maybe in Kansas City or in Missouri, and Kansas or Missouri. And this is just going to create additional confusion, challenges, and new needs of the community on both sides of the border, both on the northern Mexican side and in the interior of the U.S. And we also expect a larger number of unaccompanied minors, because what happens is the word gets out that it's harder for adults to get asylum, but they're letting children in because there are protections for unaccompanied minors. And so the tough decision that often happens for families is, well, I'd rather have my children make it safely or be reconnected with a family on the other side. And so, you know, when deterrence policies like these get implemented on the southern border, you just start seeing a spike in unaccompanied minors being sent ahead, with the hope that at least they will be out of harm's way. They won't be suffering the situations or the hardships that folks are suffering in the journey or even in the northern border of Mexico. To quickly talk about the immigration legal services landscape and a concept called unauthorized practice of law. If there's one thing that you got that I hope that you got out of today's presentation is that the immigration laws are complicated. Every single case is different. It's unique to its own set of facts, and folks many times have to navigate it themselves and have to be have this arduous journey of trying to do an uphill battle. I like to say time and time again that the immigration system was not designated for people with viable claims to be able to win, but it's actually it's only going to benefit a small percentage of individuals. And the majority of people are going to it's designed for having people fail or drop out and the war of attrition. Even though folks are you know, have the right to access the counsel representation, as we've mentioned, folks have to be able to afford a lawyer, to have a lawyer or be lucky enough to have low bono or free representation from our hundreds of nonprofits all over the country. And this has a huge consequence on their ability to win. Only 37% of all immigrants and 14% of detained immigrants go to court with lawyers on their side. So those of us doing this work continue to push for universal representation. We want a model and a system that guarantees and representation is paid for by the government, but unfortunately we are a long ways away from that reality. There was a study conducted by the Center for Migration Studies in 2022 that gives us data that at a national average, there's roughly one nonprofit attorney for every 3,158 undocumented people. You can see that this compared to the national average, both in Kansas and Missouri, these numbers are much, much higher. In Kansas, for every one attorney, you have over 12,000 undocumented people. And in Missouri, for every one nonprofit attorney, you have over 5,500 individuals. These numbers are just not sustainable for our nonprofit sector, and it gives you an insight on why many folks get frustrated when they call into our nonprofit agencies seeking for support. It's just there's just the infrastructure that exists right now can't keep up. It just can't keep up with the services that it needs to be able to provide. And Nicole can talk in more detail on this as a practicing attorney, but you know, caseload that is that will keep someone as an attorney with a number of cases that will keep them in above water and actually being able to ethically represent people is much lower than 3,158 cases. So we're talking maybe 100, maybe even less, and it depends on the complexity of the cases. But what's challenging for folks is that many advocates, even many of you, want to figure out how to help individuals. And we're here to unfortunately say you need to be really careful in the type of help you provide. One, you're just not allowed. There is a concept called unlawful practice of immigration law, or UPIL, which restricts the practice of law to only immigration attorneys, or this other concept known as accredited reps, which allows non-attorneys who are in nonprofits to be able to practice law. But there are so many things that you can do. A non-authorized person or someone that's not an attorney or an accredited rep can help read forms, can help with translation or interpretation, could even help with filling out forms, but that's where it starts blurring the line. What's challenging is an individual that's not an attorney or an accredited rep should not be recommending what immigration forms someone should be using, should not be talking about case strategy, definitely should not be charging fees. But the practice of practice of law means taking a set of facts. So in this case, if Nicole comes to me and I'm not an attorney and says, "Here's my situation, what should I do?" I should not be taking Nicole's facts and interpreting them and then giving an assessment. What I can do is like, not sure if you qualify for this, but here's some information about asylum. Here are some resources that how you could go navigate through the process. But even sometimes well-intending help can create a lot of harm. And so we want to make sure that individuals are not overextending themselves and not are putting someone in harm's way, even if they were well-intending. We understand that it's challenging. It's hard to connect people to legitimate resources, and many times these voids are filled by fraudulent actors. There are two great starting spots if you're not sure, and if you're not in the Kansas or Missouri region, or you're helping someone outside of these regions. There's a national directory of nonprofits providing immigration legal services that's hosted by our friends over at the Immigration Advocates Network. The link is provided. And if you need to go the private route with private attorneys, a great place to start is the American Immigration Lawyers Association, also known as AILA, to help people out. So we're now gonna, Nicole and I will do our best to answer any questions that have come in. Nicole, I'll pass it back to you. There was someone earlier when you were talking about the visa bulletin that got a little bit confused on the backlog. Can you just talk a little bit again on why there's such a big backlog on immigrant visas? And is that due to just long wait times?
Yeah, I've got the questions pulled up too. Thank you. So yeah, basically, yes, it's due to delays in processing, but it's also due to the fact that they can only, by law, process a certain number per year. So let's say there's 100,000 people in a line, they can only process, 7,000 of those per year. So even if they're doing like their best work and fast, it's just the way the system is set up that makes the line so long, if that helps a little bit. Maybe I'll grab the one about U visas. There was someone who asked about U visas, probably more referring to whether Hennessy's organization does that. I believe they do. U visa is an application that sometimes folks who have been a victim of a crime in the United States and have cooperated with law enforcement may be eligible to apply. And I do assume that JVS does those applications.
I could talk about just unaccompanied minors and what happens at the border. So want to back up and saying that one of the challenges unaccompanied minors have is that Many folks have this vision of a minor just walking up to the gate and being able to just talk to an immigration official and say, I need help, and they get taken in and processed. That's very it's actually not the most common way that most minors get seek asylum at the border. Many of them have challenges even being able to get to the gate because they have to evade law enforcement and immigration officials on the Mexican side. Those of you that have been able to cross recently know how much more militarized things are even before being able to get to the gate. And so if those minors actually attempt to get to the gate through the quote unquote most legal pathway that exists for them, and where all their protections should be made available to them, it's very likely they'll get apprehended by Mexican immigration, be put in child protective custody in Mexico, and the most common outcome for them is deportation back to home country, under the realm of reunification to family in home country, even if that situation was one that might put them back into danger or harm's way that they were fleeing from initially. So that's why you often see many minors being sent by, through organized crime or human smuggling and entering in other ways. But once they're have entered the U.S., the U.S. has the obligation to process them as such and put them in custody of Office of Refugee Resettlement, and where their case can continue and support can be given to them, and the possibility of reunification with someone in the U.S. can happen. What often happens for minors that are traveling with an adult is that they're most likely not traveling with a biological parent or someone who's actually a parent. This is when they're traveling with maybe an older sibling, or they're traveling with an aunt or uncle or grandmother or grandfather, etc. Those will be those are relationships that are not viewed as the parent relationship, and that's where separation happens at the border, and it's very traumatic for many folks who don't, I'm like, even like in a grandmother situation, many grandmothers see themselves as the mother of that child, and are never even expecting to be separated for a moment. And especially with the new asylum ban, something that we could start seeing is minor gets processed and continues on, and adult gets sent either back to home country or a third country, in this case Mexico or somewhere else. So the concern for family separation with these deterrence policies is ever so significant and alarming for us at the southern border.
And I know we're at time, Genital. I don't know if it's okay if we answer a couple more, or
Yeah.
I think that was a yes. I'll
Yeah.
just,
So from 11 until I guess we're out of questions, or noon, whichever comes first, we'll be answering questions. So if any of you have any questions here, again, feel free to put them in the Slack, or if you want to come up here and ask everybody, then that would work too.
great. There's a couple more in the chat that I'll just do real quick. Just Alma's question about unaccompanied minors and legal rep and guardian ad litem, just to continue off of what Luis was saying. So yes, generally, especially once they're released, usually to a parent, if they can be reunified with a parent or an adult sibling here in the United States, they're not, it's the one area of legal representation and immigration court that has made some progress on universal rep. There's a little more funding available for programs like through, it's not Vera anymore, but Acacia. But sometimes there are, like, I think New York City has guaranteed representation for minors. They can get an attorney just like adults, like in our area. We, folks in Missouri and Kansas can have an attorney, but their one is not provided to them, and no guardian ad litem, unfortunately. And then Luis, I don't know if you wanted to do that one about the role that Mexico is playing in the border stuff, like how Mexico is handling migrants on that side.
Yeah, and unfortunately, very little to no support is officially being offered by the Mexican government. All the weight of needs of migrants is being put on civil society. So I'm talking about nonprofits, churches, the shelters that are on Mexico's northern border are being asked to step up and fulfill all the needs of individuals and rely on donations, etc. So they're seeing larger numbers, both those shelters that are supporting unaccompanied minors and families or adults have a lot of concern with Mexico continuing to negotiate these and agree to these policies that the U.S. is implementing without any actual monetary or financial or even structural support from the Mexican government to assist them.
Okay, I have a couple comments too, about things I heard and some additional information. First off, during the trial of Juan Orlando Hernandez in March in New York City on narco trafficking charges and weapons possession, he was found guilty, by the way. It was brought out that the government of Honduras during his administration worked with the gangs, and there was evidence presented that there was cooperation between the gangs and the government, which I think then leads to the issue of whether or not gang violence in an asylum claim can become the basis of an asylum claim because there's government action involved. And so I wondered, I have a couple other things to ask too, but I wondered if the lawyers can comment on that.
I'm sorry, my internet was kind of cutting off, but it was about Honduras and the government being involved with the gangs and showing that.
There was evidence in in Ho's trial
Yes.
of that.
Yeah, that's a really good example of when we are dealing with like a non-government actor. So in this case, sometimes gang members or even other folks, the proving that the government is unable or unwilling, direct evidence like that of corruption or of, sort of that those kinds of articles are definitely the type of thing that we are using in asylum cases to show the immigration judge that this government, sometimes is just trying but failing, and other times is unwilling. So trying not to control and in actual cahoots with, the persecutor in whichever case that we're dealing with. So.
Yeah, okay, thanks. The other issue is in January 2023, the Biden administration issued an executive order on deferred action for people who are victims of labor law violations. This could be a violation of your health and safety rights. It could be wage theft, which is probably the most common thing, failure to pay overtime. There's a whole discrimination for race or ethnic origins. And the provision is that if you file a case under your rights as a worker, then you can apply for deferred action for 2 years and get a work permit. And of course, this will only last as long as Biden is in office, which, maybe only until January, we don't know. And it would most certainly be eliminated by Trump. But it's a real boon for many, many workers who are routinely victimized by voracious employers. And so if you run into people like that who have had some kind of labor law violation, then you should really encourage them to get help in order to try to get deferred action. And then the last thing I wanted to say is that my organization, the Cross Border Network, has a fund called the Bienvenido Fund, where we work with nonprofit immigration attorneys to help with the charges that USCIS is charging for various procedures. And so if you run across people who have cases that are either pro bono or low bono, you can refer them to us. Thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Judy. I have a couple I can just take real quickly, if that's okay. Marta was asking what happens if people can't apply for asylum within a year. They're not barred from requesting protection. So certainly if you come across someone and it's been over a year, it's not a, oh, you shouldn't do anything, or, you know, just forget about your case, or definitely still, if you're afraid to return, they should file. They just won't be eligible for the full protection of asylum, and they'll have to make a case for something that's called withholding of removal. It's just a higher standard. It's definitely harder to win. So very important if someone's like real close to their 1-year deadline, to try to hook them up real quickly with representation so they can figure that out. There was another question about there's something happening in immigration court where cases are getting dismissed. And so the question asked about like a lawyer closing the case in the immigration court. Generally, that's under something called prosecutorial discretion. And so it is the way in which the Biden administration has told ICE prosecutors, basically, we don't have enough resources to process all these cases. If folks merit discretion, so if they've, you know, they're an asylum seeker and they've have kids here and they're going to school or whatever it is, they can make a request to dismiss or terminate those asylum proceedings, those removal proceedings. And the person is just here in the United States, they're undocumented, but they don't have an order of deportation, which is often the best outcome. As you saw, those stats for approval rates for asylum are like under 10% of people win. And so we are often suggesting to our clients that prosecutorial discretion might be their best option. So the question from the person who asked it was if they could appeal. You can't appeal that decision. Someone in that situation might choose to file an affirmative asylum application. So outside of court, you can file for asylum. It's pretty complex. I think that there are some immigrants in those situations who are thrilled to have their cases closed. Obviously, like as an attorney, we would make the decision our client wants to make. Like I never unilaterally make that decision. But sometimes even if people have chosen that, it feels confusing or, but again, I think that generally attorneys are only recommending that option if it's sort of the best option for someone who's maybe necessarily going to lose. So that's that. And I think there was just one more about Leslie was asking about if someone without legal status is charged with a crime, do they still have a right to due process and removal proceedings? Generally, yes. There are certain like super serious crimes that might result in an automatic order, but it's very few. So even folks who might have, like if you get a DUI or some sort of simple assault charges or criminal convictions certainly have consequences, and even arrests without convictions have consequences to the immigration. Generally, unless it's like an incredibly serious crime, they would still have due process. They would still have a court proceeding to attend and hearings to have to determine whether they are removable or deportable from the United States.
Just want to highlight Jessica Piedra's comments, and hopefully Jessica, you're super active on the Slack channel. Just providing some local insights that folks are not eligible in Kansas or Missouri for any benefits. Probably this was referring to undocumented individuals. Undocumented students are barred from attending public universities in Missouri at any cost. Lawfully present students or DACA are charged international tuition, and Kansas has in-state tuition for undocumented students. So thank you for sharing that local info.
And Nicole, did you already cover what happens when they cannot apply for asylum within a year?
I did, yes.
Thank you.
Donna, I could download the app.
Yeah, what's your
Oh,
question?
Can I ask a question that you could just relate to them?
Sure.
So they talk about refugee status versus asylum. being ill-informed, I'm guessing there are countries that will never grant refugee status versus countries that will. That's why people have to come and do the asylum route.
Were you guys able to answer that
Yes.
question?
Yep,
Okay.
and you're right on. That's absolutely true. The UN has, I'm sure, a system for deciding where they send their High Commissioner of Refugees to, set up shop and process people's claims. Obviously, this is usually in places where there's mass persecution, of genocide or certain groups or conflict zones, like Afghanistan, for example. So those, but you're absolutely right that there are not those places set up in most of these countries from which we are seeing folks come. It's not that they're, skipping the UNHCR stop on their way to the United States. There's just not an option. There's no place for them to apply for refugee status. That has been a sort of less highlighted topic in the Biden administration. They've tried to do more of this, set up more of these offices, and I don't know if Luis has a better handle on it, but it's very slow moving and not very effective, I would say. Like in Colombia, I think there's some, and
Yeah, nothing to add there. I know there's a smaller program that tries to do this with unaccompanied minors from Central America, and it has its own challenges there as well.
right.
Go ahead.
Just a couple points to what Judy Ansel said earlier. During the crack cocaine epidemic, there's been some case law that has pointed to the government involvement in that with the whole Iran-Contra scandal. And I know that really exacerbated the number of people that were seeking asylum during that time that may have contributed to the backlog of cases during that time. And I worked in Kansas in 2008. And I'm not going to name the name of the company that I was at, but I became aware of the fact that the people that were cleaning the office building were not being paid, and they hadn't been paid for about almost 6 months. And they couldn't say anything because they were undocumented. I contacted the Kansas Department of Labor and reported the employer that was doing this, and absolutely nothing happened. And I noticed that you've got 3 times as many cases in Kansas, 12,000 as opposed to 5,000 in Missouri. And I think people are going to Kansas, from the border states, some of the South American countries, because of Tyson, because they know they can get employment in Kansas, but once they get there, they give them 1 or 2 paychecks and then they stop paying them. And this is rampant. It's not an isolated case.
I could also call it new rates.
Right, but yeah, and they also do interdiction. I've seen this myself, going home late at night where they would pull over vans that look like they had construction equipment in them, knowing that these guys are getting paid cash, and threaten them and take their money. The police are doing this.
Yeah, let me just make some comment to that, because as far as Kansas state government is concerned, first off, they don't enforce immigration. But Kansas has a wage theft law. Missouri does not. And so, it depends on who the governor is, but right now, workers in Kansas who are victims of wage theft can actually try to get some redress through the Kansas Department of Labor. I don't remember what the situation was like in 2008 when you were talking about.
That was Brownback.
It was Brownback, yeah, and he pretty much dismantled that kind of enforcement in the Kansas Department of Labor. But in Kansas, of course, there's a huge meatpacking industry, which attracts lots and lots of people for those jobs. I imagine that's one of the reasons why there's so many more cases coming out of Kansas for asylum.
I have a question. I have a client. Last week, they contacted me for a referral because they tried to use that referral action for these people, this person was discriminated on the job and they was fired. He's undocumented, but they had a lawyer and they say, but the lawyer asked them to open a case on the Department of Labor in Missouri. But these people, this person they're trying to open, but it's hard to prove. How say factual is that they really can have a case like a, because I work like a bilingual service coordinator, and I remember I went to a lawyer and they say here in Missouri it's so hard to get some kind of I'll say trials like that, but file because it's not too much protect the employees. But
Yeah.
how-
Let me talk to you afterwards about that specific case in Missouri. Clearly, the Missouri Department of Labor and Industrial Relations is not the most friendly place right now for immigrants, and I'd suggest going to a different agency like the EEOC to file a discrimination case, rather than trying to rely on the state government right now.
Did you have a question?
Oh, I was just curious, and probably something I could Google, which is why I put my hand down. But what's being done in like policy or anything to like, or is there anything being done? Because I saw on your chart that there's like a decrease in immigrants or migrants from like European countries.
Yeah.
So is there anything being done in policy to like, I guess like mitigate the change, you know, like if we're having a decrease in Europeans that are looking to immigrate here, are we then allowing those, you know, spaces somewhere else?
Well, I think refer back to Nicole's chart about the wait times. And you can see that they haven't done that. I mean, if you're from Europe, it's much easier to get in through family reunification than it is if you're from Africa, Asia, or Latin America. No, nothing is being done. I mean, the politics of immigration right now are really toxic. And they're toxic because of the xenophobic attitudes of many people on the right, and particularly Trump. And they are hoping, the Republicans are hoping to win the election on hate of immigrants, in part, at least in part. And rather than taking a very different stand, it looks like the Democrats are just following along. So right now, the idea of any kind of comprehensive immigration reform is that would be beneficial to you know, equalizing and getting rid of the discrimination against people of color. I think that's off the books right now. And it's going to be up to the American people and our immigrants to make the case for that, because it's clearly moved to the right.
I didn't see the Cuban people. I know they have a special program of the M2020, but now how they are in the people from Cuba. The same,
Yeah, the Biden administration, the Cubans don't have the same rights they had several years ago. Basically, we let in people who were victims of countries we didn't like. So, and that's still the case. So we still are letting in Cubans and Venezuelans because we have, you know, very negative policies towards those countries. I mean, we have sanctions against those countries. It's the sanctions that are often driving people out. So, and we're still letting those people in.
they are no longer refugees, or they are.
They're not refugees. No, they come under special rules in terms of immigration, but not through the refugee system.
Neither asylum.
Humanitarian.
Yeah, yes, humanitarian, and they apply for asylum. Yeah.
Lee, Nicole, did you guys have anything else to add on policy or other elements?
No, I don't think so, no.
Does anyone else have any questions?
I have just that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Yes, when the people, when they fill the application for asylum, when they are out, and it's better that someone helps that individuals to feel like a lawyer for making more strong the case? Or why the cases that are like a 65% denied? Because it's not the form is not properly filled, or they're not enough.
Okay, yes, I definitely understand your question. No, probably to some extent, yes, but the great majority of cases are denied because our judges have really strict interpretation of asylum law. So even a very well-prepared application often is denied because the judge can find some way under the law to say that the person hasn't met their burden. So it's the respondent who is the immigrant, it's their burden to show that they qualify. So certainly, you know, rates of denial for people with lawyers is lower, you know, more people who have a lawyer win, but even those, you know, even our cases get denied very frequently because the judges are just using a very strict interpretation of the law, and asylum law is difficult sort of anywhere. There are other immigration courts where there might be one judge who denies maybe 85% of cases, and another judge in the same court with the same law, with the same sort of interpretation of the law in their circuit that denies only 10%. So it is a big problem, I think, with our immigration court system, with our asylum law, that there is such a large disparity between approval rates, even in the same court, and certainly between jurisdictions. Some of that depends on the way the different circuits have interpreted, circuit courts have interpreted asylum law throughout the years, but I think it's a big sort of failure of the system that someone sitting in the same jurisdiction can have such varied approval rates for these asylum cases. But it's not just bad filling out of the form.
And this is what we mean, that the system is not actually designed to help people with valid claims succeed. And when we're meeting folks at the on the Mexican side of the border and explaining how the asylum system works, I meet folks with really strong asylum cases, and I can't even assure them that they're going to win. I say, look, here's what the law says, here's how it should work. You have a strong claim, but that doesn't guarantee you that you will win. It's a lot going to depend on which judge you have, what court you get put into, and there's some strategy conversation there. But it's like it's like the lottery. It's like many times it's like, let's spin the wheel and see if everything will align for you and if you will win the lottery and be granted asylum, unfortunately.
Excuse me. And then I understand the nonprofits, they are not helping to make the asylum application. They have to hire like a immigration lawyer. And do you know more or less the range of because I have clients or participants, they say they took me $4,000 and then we went to the court and was closed. And I think the people is like yes, like they feel the Section 8 or from the lawyers, they already took all my money and I don't have nothing. But you know.
Yes, yeah, it is really hard. So nonprofit organizations, mine, Hennessy's, there are a couple in Kansas City as well. We can take asylum cases, and they do, you know, even though we're at a nonprofit, we can represent them in their claims. However, as you mentioned, private attorney, and as Luis touched on, it is incredibly work intensive, you know, effort intensive process to represent an asylum case. And so private attorneys do charge often $7,000, $10,000, and many very good attorneys charge that much, and rightly so. I mean, it is an incredible amount of money. It's crazy to think about having to pay it, but what I'm getting at is not every attorney who charges that much is like unscrupulous or untrustworthy. It just isn't, you know, they have to pay for their time, they have to keep the lights on, they have to keep their printer running, and it's a professional service. So the $7,000 to $10,000 is not in and of itself like an exploitative amount. Certainly there are bad attorneys or people who are untrustworthy or people who don't know asylum law who are charging a lot of money as well. But that's all to say, we need so many more lawyers, or we need a totally different system, because it is important for folks to get orientation. I think, but I don't know. As Louise talked about, and here in St. Louis, we are making efforts to put together more what are called like pro se workshops, where people can come and receive limited assistance from lawyers and accredited reps, and do like asylum applications in a day with some guidance and advice, but not full representation. I don't know of any that are actively happening in Kansas City right now for defensive cases. So for cases in court, I think there have been some for the Afghan community who are applying affirmatively for asylum, but that's just another sort of plug for like, we as a community can come up with creative solutions to address these problems of the lack of representation, but ultimately it just has to be like a whole system change. It's hard.
Kind of speaking to the system change, maybe a question more directed at you. Are those immigration judges that we vote for in any of our general elections, or is that, how are they appointed?
I don't know if you're referring to me, but I'm happy to take that one. Or was that for Judy?
Either, whoever will answer.
No, go ahead and take it. She wants to know how immigration judges are elected or appointed.
Yeah, so unfortunately, it's, as I mentioned, it is immigration court is an administrative court, so it's not in the judicial branch. They aren't, although it's federal law, it's not like in the federal court system. It's a complicated process, but it's like, for example, like a Social Security administrative hearing. That's the same type of agency. It's an executive branch, and they are not appointed. They apply. We don't vote for them. There's very little oversight of immigration judges. There's some really terrible immigration judges who've done terrible things, who are still on the bench. So it's really unfortunate that there's not a recourse or like any activism that can happen sort of at that level. It really has to be like the whole system nationally that needs like an overhaul, but Luis probably has some better things to say.
No, and I was just to say many of them are former ICE attorneys, and so there's a big push to get a lot of folks like Nicole to consider becoming an immigration judge, but you know, folks like Nicole don't want to be in the seat deporting people, and so there's this like, how do we fix the system in different ways? So one of it is folks who are have a more friendly interpretation of the law may be able to take those positions. Maybe one of you in the audience, but yeah, there is a lot of challenges with that system.
A question regarding unaccompanied minors filling out their asylum application. Does there have to be an adult that signs off on that? Who does their sponsor sign it? Does the adult sign it?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is a lot of nuance to practice with unaccompanied minors. Generally, but immigration forms generally have to be signed by anyone over age 14. So under 14, a parent usually signs, but certainly there are cases where an unaccompanied minor doesn't have a parent that's worked, even if they've been reunited with a parent, sort of the attorney-client relationship is with the child. And so no real answer there, other than it's sort of case specific. They're not required to sign it if they're under 14, but they often do. And they do obviously need significant help, and often significant help with the content from a parent if there is, sort of a working relationship with the parent and child, which isn't always the case.
And we should assume, so an unaccompanied minor comes from the detention center and is placed with a sponsor here. We should assume that paperwork's probably not happening unless someone tells them at that point to do the paperwork.
Right, yes. And I think like generally, the system, as Luis alluded to, of ORR, of Office of Refugee Resettlement, and sort of the way that unaccompanied minors are processed, they are supposed to have some post-release services, you know, someone who's checking in. Are you with the sponsor? Like, is everything going okay? Did you get them enrolled in school? And reminding them of immigration deadlines like that, or connecting them to legal services. Often at the shelter, someone's done like a sort of initial screening about what relief they might be eligible for, whether it's asylum or something else, and then can connect them to someone locally. So we often get requests, you know, from, you know, a shelter in New York or a shelter on the border or wherever that is housed an unaccompanied child who then is seeking representation in our area. But it obviously isn't a perfect system. And I am gonna say, unfortunately, I have to hop off. So I don't know if there's any like final question or just to thank you all for your time, for your insightful questions, for being open to learning about this. I like to say at the end of every presentation, please tell someone something you learned today, because I think that immigration is such a complex area. It's so much like sort of omnipresent in the news, but always misrepresented, I think. And so if you learned a little fact today, please share it with someone.